Inspector Tobias Graves arrived at Thornfield Manor just as the November dusk settled over the gardens, transforming the once pleasant landscape into something altogether more sinister. He was a man of 50-odd years, with the weathered face of someone who had spent 3 decades untangling human wickedness, and he carried with him an air of quiet competence that immediately supplanted Constable Markham's uncertain authority. The inspector's first act was to arrange the household into the drawing-room, where they would remain under observation while he conducted preliminary interviews in the library. It was a shrewd decision, Miss Marple noted. Keeping everyone together meant watching not only their words but their reactions to one another's presence, far more revealing than isolated conversations could ever be. She found herself seated between Mrs. Pemberton and a nervous young woman, introduced as Eleanor Thornfield, Edmund's granddaughter, who had arrived at the manor only the previous week for what was supposed to be a pleasant extended visit. Eleanor was perhaps 25, with her grandfather's sharp features softened by youth and rendered quite striking by her obvious distress. Her hands twisted continually in her lap, and her eyes kept darting toward the doorway, as though expecting something terrible to emerge from beyond it. "Poor Uncle Edmund," Eleanor whispered, though no one had spoken to her. "I only just arrived on Friday. I hardly knew him, truly. My father and he were not close, and I grew up mostly abroad. But still, to think someone here meant him harm." Catherine sat rigidly on the opposite side of the room, her composure remarkable given the circumstances. She had changed into a dark dress. Practical, Miss Marple observed, as though she had anticipated that mourning attire might be required sooner rather than later. When the young woman's distressed whispers reached her ears, Catherine's expression did not shift, though her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Dr. Ashford paced near the fireplace, his medical training apparently making him uncomfortable with enforced idleness. He had provided Inspector Graves with preliminary observations about the body, the symptoms consistent with cyanide poisoning, the rapid onset, the complete absence of struggle suggesting the poison had been administered in something Edmund had consumed voluntarily. The inspector had received this information with a nod, neither surprised nor particularly enlightened. It was during this observation of the drawing-room's occupants that Miss Marple noticed something that struck her as particularly significant. When the inspector had mentioned cyanide specifically, Dr. Ashford had not reacted with the surprise one might expect from a physician who had merely guessed at the cause of death. Instead, he had seemed almost to be confirming something he had already suspected. The distinction was subtle, but it was there. The vicar and his wife occupied one corner, Margaret conducting a whispered conversation about the necessity of organizing a proper Christian burial and how quickly one might arrange such things without appearing improper. Reverend Blackwood, meanwhile, seemed genuinely distressed, his faith apparently offering him no comfort in the face of such violence within his parish. Miss Marple found herself wondering whether his distress stemmed from the murder itself or from the threat it posed to the carefully ordered community he had spent so many years cultivating. Colonel Hartley had claimed one of the leather chairs and appeared to be dozing, though Miss Marple suspected this was a strategic retreat from discomfort rather than genuine sleep. The colonel had known Edmund for most of his adult life. He would have understood, better than most, the full extent of the dead man's considerable capacity for creating resentment. Mrs. Pemberton sat with the posture of someone bearing an intolerable weight. She had served the Thornfield family since her youth and had witnessed, one could only assume, the entire arc of Edmund's personality, which, from what Miss Marple had gathered through village gossip, had not improved with age. The housekeeper's hands bore the calluses of decades of work, and her face told the story of a woman who had invested her life in service to a man who had likely never thanked her adequately. Thomas, the groundskeeper, stood awkwardly near the doorway, clearly desperate to be anywhere else. He was perhaps 23 or 24, with the muscular build of someone accustomed to physical labor and the anxious expression of someone thoroughly out of place in a drawing-room filled with his social betters. Miss Marple caught him glancing repeatedly at Catherine, with an intensity that suggested his thoughts were considerably occupied with something beyond fear of police investigation. When Inspector Graves called the first name for interview, Catherine's, naturally, there was a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Several people seemed to relax slightly, as though they were grateful to delay their own interrogation. Catherine rose with composure and followed the inspector from the room without protest or apparent anxiety. As the door closed behind them, Eleanor leaned toward Miss Marple with the desperate need of the young to confide in someone who might understand their confusion. "Miss Marple," the girl said softly, "I keep thinking about what might have happened if I had arrived earlier in the day rather than just before tea. What if I had been alone with him? What if someone thought I was someone else?" Her voice trembled. "Who would poison an LD man at his own birthday celebration? What sort of person does such a thing?" Miss Marple turned toward the young woman with the gentle expression she had perfected over decades of listening to village troubles. "My dear," she said quietly, "that is precisely the question the inspector will spend considerable time answering, and from my experience, the answer is usually far more ordinary and far more tragic than one might initially suppose." Catherine Thornfield's interview lasted precisely 23 minutes, a fact that Miss Marple noted with the same quiet attention she gave to all small, seemingly inconsequential details. When the young woman emerged from the library, her composure remained intact, though there was now a brittleness to it, as though she had been forced to maintain her composure through considerable effort of will. She resumed her seat without comment, and the inspector called for Dr. Ashford next. The physician's interview proved considerably longer, extending past 40 minutes, during which the drawing-room fell into an uncomfortable silence, punctuated only by Eleanor's nervous fidgeting and the occasional creak of the old house settling around them. Miss Marple used the time to observe the others more carefully, noting the small tells that betrayed underlying currents of emotion. Colonel Hartley had abandoned his pretense of sleep and now sat with his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his jaw working as though he were engaged in an internal argument. Mrs. Pemberton had pulled out her knitting, a practical grey wool scarf that seemed destined to never reach completion, and her needles clicked with a rhythm that suggested decades of muscle memory, performing its task independent of conscious thought. Reverend Blackwood had taken up a position near the window, his back to the room, apparently absorbed in contemplation of the darkened garden beyond. It was Dr. Ashford's expression when he returned from his interview that provided the most revealing moment. He looked genuinely shaken in a way that his carefully maintained physician's demeanor had prevented him from displaying before. His eyes sought out Catherine immediately, and there passed between them a look of such concentrated anxiety that Miss Marple found herself filing away this exchange as potentially significant. Whatever the inspector had asked him, it had struck something vulnerable beneath his professional exterior. The next interview belonged to Mrs. Pemberton, who rose with the resignation of someone heading toward her own execution. She set down her knitting with careful deliberation, as though establishing that, despite everything, domestic routine must continue. Her absence from the drawing-room seemed to release some tension among the remaining occupants, a circumstance that suggested her presence had been suppressing candid conversation. Eleanor immediately seized the opportunity to speak more freely. "Mrs. Pemberton has been with Uncle Edmund forever," she whispered to Miss Marple. "Mother always said she was the only person who could manage him. But I've noticed they hardly speak to each other anymore. It's quite sad, really, as though they've simply run out of things to say after all these years." "People often do," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "Familiarity has a peculiar way of breeding distance as easily as it breeds understanding. Tell me, my dear, how well did you know your uncle before you arrived this week?" Eleanor's answer came readily enough, a recitation of schoolgirl memories of a man who seemed always to be disappointed, always to be finding fault, always to be regarding his younger relatives with the cold assessment of someone calculating their eventual utility. It was a portrait of Edmund Thornfield that aligned precisely with the village gossip Miss Marple had accumulated over the years. "He seemed particularly cross this week," Eleanor continued. "When I arrived, I thought perhaps it was the excitement of his birthday approaching that had made him irritable. But now I wonder—" She trailed off, her anxiety resurfacing. The drawing-room door opened again, and Mrs. Pemberton returned, her face thoroughly drained of color. She moved with the stiffness of profound shock, and when she resumed her seat, She did not pick up her knitting. Instead, she sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing in particular, the expression of someone who had just received information that fundamentally altered her understanding of her world. Colonel Hartley was summoned next, and his interview was mercifully brief, lasting only about 15 minutes. When he returned, he carried with him an air of offended dignity, as though he found the entire proceeding beneath his station, though his flush suggested the inspector had asked questions that touched upon uncomfortable topics. By the time Thomas was called for his interview, the evening had deepened considerably, and gas lamps had been lit throughout the manor, casting wavering shadows that seemed to dance with secrets. The young groundskeeper went reluctantly, his nervousness evident in every step. His absence from the drawing-room seemed to produce a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Catherine's posture, hitherto so carefully controlled, relaxed slightly, and she allowed her eyes to close for just a moment, long enough for Miss Marple to observe the exhaustion beneath her composure. Reverend Blackwood was interviewed before Thomas returned, and when the clergyman re-emerged, he looked thoroughly disturbed, muttering something about the depths of human weakness that he apparently needed to confess to his wife in hushed, urgent tones. Margaret's ex. Pression grew progressively more pinched as she listened to his whispered account of whatever the inspector had discovered or revealed. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Thomas finally returned from his interview. The young man looked devastated, his eyes red-rimmed and his usual physical confidence replaced by a hunched posture of deep distress. He sought Catherine with his eyes immediately upon entering, but she deliberately did not acknowledge his gaze, instead focusing her attention upon her lap with sudden and absorbing interest. Inspector Graves appeared in the doorway moments later. "Miss Eleanor Thornfield," he said quietly, "if you would be so kind as to come with me." As the young woman rose to follow him, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious nature of secrets. In a small village, everyone presumed everyone else knew everything. Yet clearly, she thought, there were depths of complexity in the Thornfield household that had been carefully hidden beneath the surface of ordinary domestic routine. The poison that had killed Edmund Thornfield had been administered deliberately, certainly, but by someone with access to the household, someone with reason enough to risk such a drastic action, and someone, Miss Marple suspected, who had been counting on the chaos of a birthday celebration to obscure their movements. The question now was whether Eleanor would confirm or complicate the pattern that was beginning very faintly to emerge. Eleanor's interview consumed nearly an hour, an unexpectedly lengthy duration that suggested the inspector had found considerably more to discuss with the young woman than her brief tenure at Thornfield Manor might have warranted. When she finally returned to the drawing-room, her earlier anxiety had transformed into something more closely resembling shock. She moved mechanically to her seat and sat with the stiffness of someone whose emotional resources had been thoroughly depleted. It was past 11 o'clock when Inspector Graves finally released everyone to their rooms, with the caveat that no one was to leave Thornfield Manor without his explicit permission, and that he would resume interviews the following morning with fresh perspective and, he implied, considerably sharper questions. The household dispersed with visible relief, though Miss Marple noted that the relief was tinged with apprehension rather than comfort. She found herself ascending the grand staircase beside Mrs. Pemberton, whose normally impeccable posture had collapsed into something considerably less dignified. The housekeeper seemed to have aged a decade in the course of a single evening, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the banister. "Dreadful business," the older woman murmured, more to herself than to Miss Marple. "Just dreadful. I've served this house for 40 years, and I never imagined, that someone would resort to such measures," Miss Marple finished gently. "Or that the reasons for such desperation might run deeper than ordinary observation would suggest." Mrs. Pemberton stopped on the landing and turned to regard Miss Marple with an expression that mingled gratitude with something closer to despair. "You're a perceptive woman, Miss Marple. The inspector asked me questions that made it clear he understands far more than one might hope. He asked about Mr. Edmund's habits, about who had access to the sherry, about tensions within the household. He even asked—" She paused, her voice dropping further. "He asked whether I had noticed anything unusual in Mr. Edmund's behavior toward the younger members of the household. And had you?" Miss Marple asked, her tone remaining carefully neutral. "I had noticed many things," Mrs. Pemberton said quietly. "Things that troubled me, deeply. But I am merely a servant, Miss Marple. One does not speak of such matters. One simply endures them and hopes that time will somehow resolve what one lacks the authority to address." The housekeeper continued up the stairs without elaborating further, leaving Miss Marple to follow with her mind working through the implications of this cryptic admission. The phrase "toward the younger members of the household" was particularly suggestive. Edmund Thornfield had been 90 years old, hardly a man whose improprieties could be attributed to passion or desire in any conventional sense. But there were other forms of malice available to the elderly, other ways of exerting control and causing harm that required no physical strength, merely a certain cruelty of spirit and access to vulnerable targets. She was shown to a small guest bedroom on the second floor, a pleasant enough room with period furnishings and a view that would overlook the gardens in daylight. She prepared for bed with her customary methodical care, though sleep seemed unlikely to come readily. Her mind was too occupied with the peculiar architecture of the Thornfield household and the various pressures that had been building within it. It must have been nearly 2 in the morning when she heard the footsteps in the hallway. Quick, purposeful footsteps that suggested someone moving with urgent intention, rather. The breakfast table erupted into immediate chaos. Eleanor gasped audibly, her teacup clattering against its saucer. Catherine's carefully maintained composure fractured, revealing a flash of something that might have been fear or anger, or both in equal measure. Dr. Ashford set down his fork with deliberate care, as though controlling even this small gesture required considerable concentration. Mrs. Pemberton's face went absolutely white, and she gripped the edge of the table as though she feared she might otherwise collapse. "This is preposterous," Colonel Hartley declared loudly, his indignation providing convenient cover for what Miss Marple suspected was genuine alarm. "Are you suggesting one of us stole from Edmund's study?" "That is an outrageous accusation, Inspector." "Outrageous. I have made no accusation," Inspector Graves replied calmly, "merely stated a fact. The will is missing. Someone in this household took it. Whether that someone is also responsible for Mr. Thornfield's death remains to be determined, but it is difficult to imagine the two events being entirely unrelated. After all, a will altered only weeks before one's death, then hastily removed from the premises, suggests circumstances of considerable urgency and desperation. Margaret Blackwood had turned to her husband with an expression of barely concealed alarm. The vicar's face had taken on a peculiar greyish tone, and he appeared to be engaged in some form of internal debate regarding whether he should volunteer information or maintain his silence. Eleanor suddenly stood, her chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice shaking. "Last night, after everyone had retired, Thomas came to my room. He said he needed to speak with me privately about something urgent. He was terrified, Inspector, absolutely terrified. He told me that on the afternoon of the party, he had seen Catherine with a small glass bottle. She was mixing something into Uncle Edmund's sherry when she thought no one was watching. The accusation hung in the air like a physical thing. Catherine's face went from pale to flushed in a matter of seconds, and she rose from her seat with sudden violence. "That is a complete fabrication," she said, her voice cutting and cold. "Eleanor is lying, either out of malice or because that boy has filled her head with nonsense to protect H. himself. Why would Thomas need protection?" Inspector Graves asked, his tone remaining perfectly neutral despite the obvious escalation of tension in the room. Eleanor's answer came haltingly, with the reluctance of someone revealing secrets that were not entirely her own to reveal. "Because Thomas was in love with my uncle. Or rather, my uncle was pursuing Thomas. Thomas told me that Uncle Edmund had been making improper advances toward him for months. He said Uncle Edmund had promised him money, had threatened him with dismissal if he refused. Thomas said he couldn't take it anymore, that he was going to speak to someone about what was happening." The room fell into a stunned silence. Dr. Ashford's face had become a mask of conflicted emotion. Mrs. Pemberton's hands had begun to tremble visibly. Catherine sat back down slowly, her expression now one of cold fury rather than panic. "This is absurd," Catherine said quietly. "Yes, my uncle was a disagreeable man. Yes, he was improper with members of the household. I have been dealing with his behavior for 3 years, managing his affairs, protecting people from his worst impulses, but I did not poison him. And if Thomas has accused me, then he is either protecting himself or he has been coached by someone with considerably more sophisticated motives than simple revenge." Inspector Graves rose to his feet. "I think," he said slowly, "that we need to speak with Thomas more thoroughly regarding these allegations, as well as examining where precisely he was when the sherry was being prepared and served. It is also becoming increasingly apparent that several of you have been withholding information of considerable importance. I must warn you that obstruction of a murder investigation carries serious legal consequences." He turned to Constable Markham, who had been standing unobtrusively near the door throughout this exchange. "Bring Thomas to the library. Now." As the constable departed on his errand, Miss Marple found herself observing the various reactions of those remaining at the breakfast table with particular attention. Catherine's anger seemed genuine, but it was also, she noted, conveniently directed toward Eleanor and Thomas rather than toward the more problematic questions the inspector had raised. Dr. Ashford was staring at his plate with the intensity of someone engaged in crucial calculations. Eleanor had resumed her seat and was now looking considerably less confident about the accusation she had just made, as though she had suddenly realized the potential consequences of her own revelations. Most intriguingly, Mrs. Pemberton was studying Catherine with an expression that suggested she possessed knowledge about the young woman's activities that extended beyond what Eleanor's testimony had revealed. The housekeeper's lips were compressed into a thin line, and her fingers were clenched together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious nature of household secrets. Edmund Thornfield had apparently been indulging in behavior that was not merely improper, but genuinely predatory. Yet this information had been known to multiple people. Mrs. Pemberton certainly, likely Dr. Ashford given his professional relationship with the family, possibly others, and no one had acted upon it beyond a kind of weary damage control. It was the silence of people who had learned that certain violations were simply the price of remaining in proximity to power and property. When Thomas was brought into the dining room, he looked even more devastated than he had the previous evening. His eyes sought Eleanor's immediately, and Miss Marple caught the moment of terrible realization crossing his features as he understood that his confidence had been immediately betrayed to the authorities. Inspector Graves wasted no time. "Thomas, Eleanor Thornfield has just accused Catherine Thornfield of poisoning Mr. Edmund Thornfield, claiming you witnessed her preparing the poison. I need to know whether this accusation is truthful or whether you have been manipulated into providing false evidence to protect yourself from suspicion. And I suggest you consider very carefully before you answer, because your credibility is currently your most valuable asset in this investigation." Thomas's face crumpled. I didn't see anything," he said, his voice barely audible. "I was afraid. When the constable questioned me last night, he asked me things about my relationship with Mr. Edmund, things that terrified me. I told Eleanor because I needed to talk to someone, and she said if I told her something that would help the investigation, it might protect me. But I didn't actually see Catherine poison anything. I was just trying to survive." Eleanor's fabrication unraveled with the speed of poorly constructed deception, and the young woman's face flushed with a combination of shame and defiance. "I was trying to help," she said defensively, though her voice had lost all conviction. "Catherine has been taking control of everything. She's been isolated from us, managing Uncle Edmund's money, making decisions about the household. How was I supposed to know what she was actually capable of?" "By observing rather than inventing," Inspector Graves replied coldly. "By allowing the investigation to proceed based on evidence rather than speculation. Your attempt to manipulate the inquiry has now significantly complicated matters and cast doubt upon legitimate testimony that might have been forthcoming from other sources." He turned his attention back to Thomas, with an expression that suggested a growing recognition of complexity beneath the surface explanations. "You mentioned that Mr. Thornfield's behavior had become intolerable. Can you specify precisely when his inappropriate conduct began?" Thomas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "It was about 6 months ago. He called me to his study one evening, ostensibly to discuss repairs needed on the garden wall. Instead, he began asking me personal questions, inappropriate questions about my circumstances, my family, my financial situation. When I tried to leave, he became angry. He said that as the owner of Thornfield Manor, he had certain expectations of those in his employ. He said he would be generous with those who cooperated and dismissive of those who did not." Miss Marple found herself watching Mrs. Pemberton's reaction to this narrative, and what she observed was particularly revealing. The housekeeper's expression suggested not shock, but rather confirmation of something she had long suspected. The set of her shoulders indicated a burden of knowledge that had weighed upon her for considerable time. "Mrs. Pemberton," Inspector Graves said, apparently following the same line of observation as Miss Marple, "you appear unsurprised by these allegations. How long have you been aware of Mr. Thornfield's behavior toward members of the household staff?" The housekeeper took a long moment before responding. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of accumulated silence. "I became aware of such conduct approximately 8 months ago. A young housemaid came to me in tears, stating that Mr. Thornfield had made inappropriate advances toward her. I confronted him about the matter, and he dismissed my concerns, claiming the girl had misunderstood his kindly interest in her welfare. Shortly thereafter, I made arrangements for the girl to be placed in a position with a respectable family in the neighboring county. You removed her rather than reporting the matter to authorities," Inspector Graves observed, his tone suggesting neither approval nor disapproval, merely statement of fact. "I removed her because I believed it was the safest course of action for her," Mrs. Pemberton replied with dignity. "I reported the matter to the vicar, expecting him to counsel Mr. Thornfield on the impropriety of his conduct. I believed he would address the situation through the church, as such matters were traditionally handled. I now understand that no such conversation occurred, or if it did, it had no effect whatsoever on Mr. Thornfield's behavior. Reverend Blackwood had gone even paler during this exchange, and his wife was studying him with an expression of dawning horror. The vicar appeared to be wrestling with his conscience in real time, and the struggle was visibly winning against his natural inclination toward silence. "I did speak with Edmund," the Reverend said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was entirely unrepentant. He said that he was an old man with little time remaining on this earth, that he had earned the right to pursue whatever comforts he desired, and that those in his employ should consider themselves fortunate to receive his attention rather than offended by it. I attempted to appeal to his sense of Christian morality, but he simply laughed at me. He said that morality was a luxury for the poor, and that wealth purchased the right to transcend such petty concerns." The revelation hung in the air like a poisonous gas, contaminating the breakfast room with the clarity of Edmund Thornfield's utter depravity. What had begun as a murder investigation was now revealing itself as something considerably more complex, not merely a crime of passion or greed, but the violent terminus of a pattern of systematic predation that had been tolerated, managed, and concealed by an entire community rather than confronted. Inspector Graves stood and walked slowly toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "So we have established," he said quietly, "that Mr. Edmund Thornfield was engaged in behavior that would be prosecuted as criminal misconduct in most jurisdictions. We have also established that this behavior was known to multiple members of the household and the local clergy, none of whom took decisive action to stop it. This creates a somewhat broader pool of potential suspects, as nearly everyone in this room possessed what might be termed motive, though motive is not conviction, and I remain focused on evidence rather than speculation." He turned back to face the assembled group. "What I require now is a complete and truthful accounting of everyone's movements during the hour preceding Mr. Thornfield's collapse on the afternoon of his birthday celebration. Specifically, I need to know who had access to the sherry bottle, who was present in the study at any point during that period, and who observed anything that struck them as unusual or noteworthy. Miss Marple noticed that Dr. Ashford had begun to look increasingly uncomfortable as the inspector made these demands. The physician's fingers were drumming against the table in a nervous rhythm, and his eyes kept darting toward Catherine with an intensity that suggested unresolved communication between them. "I should perhaps clarify," the doctor said suddenly, "that I spent considerable time in the study on the afternoon in question. Mr. Thornfield had asked me to review some medical documents related to his estate planning. I was there for perhaps 40 minutes, from approximately 2 o'clock until 2:40. During that time, the sherry decanter was sitting on the side table, and I did observe Catherine entering the study briefly during my presence there." Catherine's expression turned to pure ice. "What are you insinuating, Michael?" "I am not insinuating anything," Dr. Ashford replied, though his voice suggested otherwise. "I am merely providing the factual account that the inspector has requested. You entered, you approached the decanter, and you remained there for perhaps 2 minutes before leaving. I did not observe what you were doing during that time, but I observed that you were there." Inspector Graves's attention had now crystallized entirely upon Catherine, and Miss Marple could see the moment when the investigator believed he had identified his culprit. Yet something in the scene troubled Miss Marple deeply, not the appearance of guilt, but rather the curious manner in which that guilt had been presented, as though Dr. Ashford had been waiting for the precise moment when circumstances would make his testimony most damaging. Catherine stood abruptly, her chair falling backward with a sharp clatter that punctuated her rising fury. "You are a coward and a liar, Michael," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious rage coursing through her. "Yes, I was in the study. Yes, I approached the decanter. I was pouring myself a glass of sherry because I needed something to steady my nerves before enduring another hour of my uncle's vile company and his increasingly inappropriate remarks directed at every young person within his reach. But I did not poison anything, and you know perfectly well that my presence near that decanter proves nothing whatsoever." "Then why?" Inspector Graves asked quietly. "Did you not volunteer this information during your initial interview last night?" Catherine's jaw clenched visibly. "Because I knew precisely what would happen if I admitted to being near the decanter. I would be suspected. And I also knew that Michael would eventually provide his account, framing it in whatever manner say. Arvit his purposes best. I have learned over these past 3 years that honesty is a luxury when living under my uncle's roof. Survival requires calculation." Miss Marple found herself rising to her feet with the unhurried grace that had become her signature over decades of village life. She moved toward the window, ostensibly to observe the November gardens, though in reality her attention was focused entirely on the interactions within the room behind her reflection in the glass. "Inspector Graves," she said softly without turning, "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity regarding the nature of the missing will. Specifically, when was it last observed by anyone in this household?" The inspector regarded her with the combination of patience and slight condescension that professional investigators often extended to amateur observers. The will was last seen by Mr. Thornfield himself approximately 10 days ago. He had summoned his solicitor to the manor to draft the revised version, and the solicitor departed at approximately 4 o'clock on the afternoon of October 15th. Mr. Thornfield indicated that he would place the document in his locked drawer for safekeeping, pending his review of the final version. "And no one else observed the document after that date," Miss Marple continued. "No one has admitted to doing so," Inspector Graves replied. "How curious," Miss Marple mused, turning back to face the assembled group. "One would think that in a household where financial stakes are quite clearly considerable, someone might have possessed sufficient motivation to determine what changes Mr. Thornfield had made to his estate. The locked drawer, after all, is hardly an impenetrable barrier to someone with access to the study keys." Dr. Ashford's face had begun to assume a slightly defensive expression. "Miss Marple, I fail to see the relevance of your observation. The missing will is a secondary matter to the poisoning itself. The poisoning is what requires investigation." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I had thought the two matters might be intimately connected." After all, if Mr. Thornfield had altered his will in a way that was unexpected or disadvantageous to someone in this household, that someone would have had considerable reason to wish his death to occur before the new will could be witnessed or executed. The missing will suggests someone wanted to ensure that the estate would be settled under the provisions of an older document more favorable to their interests. An uncomfortable silence had settled over the breakfast room. Eleanor was staring at Miss Marple with dawning comprehension. Mrs. Pemberton's knuckles had turned white as she gripped the edge of her chair. Inspector Graves was watching Miss Marple with the expression of a professional investigator suddenly confronted with an amateur who had identified a crucial element he had overlooked. "You're suggesting," Inspector Graves said slowly, "that the poisoning and the theft of the will are separate crimes, committed by potentially different individuals for different motives?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that it would be foolish to assume they are connected without first establishing what the will contained. Surely your investigation has extended to questioning the solicitor regarding the nature of Mr. Thornfield's proposed changes." The inspector's brief pause before responding suggested that his investigation had not, in fact, extended quite that far. "The solicitor is in London and has not yet been contacted regarding the specific provisions of the revised will. He indicated to the constable that such information would be privileged, though circumstances may warrant a waiver of that privilege." "Then I would suggest," Miss Marple said, resuming her seat with the air of someone who had said her piece and was now content to let others draw their own conclusions, "that your investigation might benefit from such a conversation before proceeding further with accusations that, however circumstantially compelling, may ultimately prove to rest upon foundations of considerable uncertainty." Catherine had been watching this exchange with visible surprise, as though the idea that someone might defend her against the inspector, apparent conviction of her guilt, was a concept sufficiently novel to merit shock. "Thank you," she said quietly to Miss Marple. "Don't thank me yet," Miss Marple replied with a slight smile. "We haven't yet established whether you are innocent of the poisoning or merely innocent of the particular theft we have been discussing. The two crimes may indeed be connected, though not in the manner the inspector initially supposed. However, I have observed that when someone appears to be guilty of one crime while being entirely innocent of another, the investigation tends to become considerably more complex before achieving resolution." Inspector Graves had moved to the telephone in the entrance hall, where he was arranging through the constable to contact the London solicitor immediately. His expression suggested that he was beginning to understand that his initial assumptions regarding the crime's straightforward nature might require considerable revision. It was during this interlude that Miss Marple noticed something else that struck her as potentially significant. Dr. Ashford had subtly moved his position so that he was no longer directly visible from the telephone's line of sight. His face had assumed a carefully neutral expression, but his fingers were once again drumming against the table with a rhythm that suggested considerable internal agitation. The question that had begun to form in Miss Marple's mind was not who had poisoned Edmund Thornfield, but rather why a respected physician would deliberately provide testimony designed to direct suspicion toward a woman he had known since childhood. What manner of leverage or coercion might motivate such a betrayal? And, more troublingly, was the poisoning itself perhaps not the primary crime at all, but rather a distraction, a violent spectacle designed to obscure some other matter of considerably greater importance to someone in this household? These were questions that would require considerably more delicate investigation than straightforward police procedure could provide. The solicitor's telephone conversation, conducted by Inspector Graves in the entrance hall with the drawing-room door left deliberately open so that his subordinates might hear the exchange, produced results that shifted the entire investigation onto new foundations. The London lawyer, initially resistant to breaching client confidentiality, became considerably more forthcoming when informed that his client was deceased and that criminal investigation necessitated disclosure of the will's contents. The revised document, dated October 15th, contained a provision that appeared to have been specifically designed to generate maximum disruption among the Thornfield household. Edmund had altered his will to leave the bulk of his substantial estate, estimated at nearly £200,000, not to his niece Catherine, who had been the primary beneficiary under the previous version, but rather to Eleanor Thornfield, his granddaughter, contingent upon her reaching the age of 30 and marrying with the family's approval. The previous will had left Eleanor merely a modest bequest of £5,000. Catherine, by contrast, had been reduced from primary heir to a modest stipend of £1,000 annually, a sum that would have been humiliating given the years she had invested in managing his household and affairs. Mrs. Pemberton had been left £500 and a cottage on the estate grounds. Dr. Ashford, who had apparently been mentioned in the previous will as a beneficiary to the tune of £10,000 for his years of medical service, had been entirely removed from the new version. The implications of these revisions were immediately apparent to everyone in the room. Catherine's motive for murder had just been substantively established. The loss of a substantial fortune was considerably more compelling than the maintenance of respect or even physical safety. But so too had Eleanor's motive become apparent, though in a more complicated fashion. The young woman would inherit considerably more wealth than she might otherwise have expected, but only if her uncle survived long enough to ensure the will was properly witnessed and filed with the solicitors. If Edmund died before formal execution of the revised document, the older will would control, leaving Eleanor with only the modest £5,000. "This is extraordinary," Inspector Graves said, returning to the breakfast room with his expression transformed by the weight of new comprehension. The revised will had not yet been formally executed, which means that at the moment of Mr. Thornfield's death, the older will, leaving Catherine as primary beneficiary, would have been the controlling document. Therefore, Catherine's position would have actually improved through his death, as she would inherit under the old provisions rather than the new ones that would have dramatically reduced her inheritance. "Precisely," Miss Marple said quietly. "Which means that if Catherine poisoned her uncle, she would have done so to prevent the new will from becoming effective, thereby ensuring her inheritance under the old provisions. But it also means that Eleanor, who would benefit considerably from the new will if her uncle had lived long enough to execute it properly, would have been motivated to keep him alive rather than poison him. The poisoning, therefore, disrupts rather than advances Eleanor's financial interests." Catherine had gone absolutely white during this recitation. "You understand now," she said to Inspector Graves, "that I had no motive to poison my uncle. If anything, I had motive to keep him alive long enough to contest the revised will, to demonstrate his mental incompetence, or to negotiate with him regarding my position. His death, occurring as it did before the new will could be properly executed, actually preserved my inheritance. I had no reason to kill him. Unless," Dr. Ashford said quietly, "you discovered the changed will before it could be executed, and poisoned him in a rage at the betrayal. The motive would not be financial calculation, but rather emotional reaction to your uncle's deliberate attempt to humiliate you." Miss Marple found herself observing the doctor with considerably more focused attention. His intervention at this moment was particularly revealing, for it suggested not the testimony of an innocent witness, but rather the machinations of someone actively engaged in manipulating the investigation's direction. A guilty man attempting to shift blame toward another suspect would indeed speak precisely as Dr. Ashford was now speaking. "Inspector Graves," Miss Marple said, "I wonder if you might indulge my curiosity regarding the precise timing of Dr. Ashford's removal from Mr. Thornfield's will. Specifically, when did the doctor become aware of this change?" The inspector consulted H.'s notes, which included the solicitor's account. The solicitor indicated that Mr. Thornfield specifically instructed him to remove Dr. Ashford from the new will, stating that the doctor had become unnecessarily presumptuous regarding his medical treatment. The solicitor states that Mr. Thornfield made this decision independently, without discussing it with the doctor beforehand. "So Dr. Ashford," Miss Marple continued, "would not have known about his removal from the will unless someone informed him of the change. Catherine could not have known the details without accessing the will itself or the solicitor's correspondence. Mrs. Pemberton would have had no reason to discuss such matters with the doctor. Eleanor only arrived at the manor last week, well after the will was executed. The implication of this analysis hung in the air like an unspoken accusation. Dr. Ashford's face had begun to assume a waxy quality, and his earlier rhythm of nervous finger-drumming had ceased entirely, replaced by complete stillness that was considerably more ominous. "I was informed of the change," the doctor said carefully, "by Edmund himself during a medical consultation approximately 1 week ago. He mentioned it almost in passing, as though the matter was of minimal importance. He said he was revising his will because he wanted to ensure that those who had been genuinely loyal to him would be rewarded, while those who had disappointed him would be appropriately recognized for their failures." "And how did you respond to this information?" Inspector Graves asked, his tone suggesting that he was beginning to perceive the shape of something considerably more sinister than a simple poisoning driven by financial motive. "I was understandably upset," the doctor admitted. "I have served the Thornfield family for 15 years. I had assumed my loyalty and professional competence would be recognized in his estate planning, but I am also a professional man, and I understood that I could not allow personal disappointment to affect my medical judgment regarding Mr. Thornfield's care. And yet," Miss Marple observed gently, "you were willing to provide testimony designed to implicate Catherine in his murder. That strikes me as a rather curious way of maintaining professional objectivity." Dr. Ashford rose abruptly from his chair, and the movement contained such barely suppressed rage that Constable Markham instinctively moved closer to him, his hand resting near his belt in a gesture that suggested readiness to restrain if necessary. "You have no idea," the doctor said, his voice trembling with emotion, "what Edmund Thornfield was capable of. You sit in judgment with your comfortable assumptions about motive and money, but you understand nothing about the nature of true cruelty. I loved Eleanor like a daughter. I had promised her that I would help her escape Edmund's house when she turned 18. Instead, I discovered that he had been attempting to— My God, the things he attempted with that girl." His voice broke, and he sank back into his chair, covering his face with his hands. Eleanor had begun to weep quietly, her body folding inward as though she could physically compress herself into insignificance. Mrs. Pemberton moved without conscious decision, placing a protective hand on the young woman's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes about the housekeeper's own understanding of what Edmund Thornfield had been attempting with his granddaughter. "He called me to his study 3 days ago," Eleanor said through her tears, her voice barely audible. "He said that since I would be inheriting significantly under the new will, I should understand the full extent of his generosity. He said that a young woman of my age and circumstances should be grateful for his attention, that he wanted to ensure I understood how to properly appreciate the gifts he was bestowing upon me." The clinical horror of this admission seemed to drain the remaining color from Dr. Ashford's face. When he spoke again, his voice had become hollow, emptied of everything except a kind of devastated recognition. "I confronted him about it," he said. "I went to his study late in the afternoon on the day of his birthday celebration. I told him that if he ever touched Eleanor again, I would ensure that every person in this village knew exactly what manner of man he was. I would destroy his reputation, his standing, everything he had built." He simply laughed at me. He said that no one would believe a country physician's accusations against a man of his wealth and social position. "And what did you do then?" Inspector Graves asked, his tone suggesting that he already understood the answer but required the doctor to voice it explicitly. "I left," Dr. Ashford said. "I walked out of that study, and I drove home, and I spent the next hour in absolute fury, contemplating how to protect Eleanor without destroying her with scandal. I considered going to the solicitor and attempting to have Edmund declared mentally incompetent. I considered speaking with you, Inspector, though I knew that, without Eleanor's willingness to formally accuse him, prosecution would be difficult. And yes, I considered poison. The admission fell into the room like a stone dropped from an enormous height. Catherine had gone absolutely rigid in her chair. Thomas was staring at the doctor with an expression of conflicted emotion, part horror, part something that might have been gratitude. "But you didn't administer the poison," Miss Marple said, "and it was not a question but rather a statement of observed fact." "No," Dr. Ashford replied quietly. "I didn't. I spent that entire hour in my study, working myself into a state of murderous rage, yes, but I could not actually bring myself to do it. I am a physician. My entire life has been dedicated to preserving life, not ending it. By the time I had begun to calm myself sufficiently to consider alternatives, it was already past 5 o'clock. I received word shortly thereafter that Edmund had collapsed during his birthday celebration. Which means, Inspector Graves said slowly, that Dr. Ashford had knowledge of motive and opportunity, but lacked actual participation in the crime. However, his subsequent testimony, designed to implicate Catherine, suggests that he was willing to allow someone else to be convicted for a murder he neither committed nor prevented. I didn't know Catherine was innocent, the doctor replied defensively. I still don't know that with absolute certainty. I only know that she was in the study at approximately 2 o'clock, and I was providing information that I believed to be relevant to the investigation. If she poisoned him, then she did so partly to protect Eleanor from his advances. That would make her guilty, yes, but not in the way a murder motivated purely by greed would be guilty. Miss Marple rose from her seat and moved toward the window once again, her posture suggesting that she was considering a matter of considerable complexity. The morning light had brightened considerably, transforming the November gardens into something almost beautiful in their winter barrenness. She stood in silence for several long moments, and when she finally turned back to face the assembled group, her expression contained a sadness that seemed to encompass far more than the simple matter of Edmund Thornfield's death. "Inspector Graves," she said quietly, "I believe you will find that the poison was administered not by Catherine, nor by Dr. Ashford, nor by any one driven by the motives we have thus far examined. Instead, I suspect you will discover that the poisoning was committed by someone whose motive was rooted not in financial self-interest or even in protective fury, but rather in something far more fundamental, the desire of someone who had endured decades of systematic degradation to reclaim a single moment of agency before death rendered such reclamation impossible." Mrs. Pemberton's entire body had gone rigid. Her hand, which had been resting on Eleanor's shoulder, had begun to tremble visibly. "Miss Marple," the housekeeper said, her voice containing a peculiar combination of defiance and resignation, "you are an exceptionally perceptive woman. Far too perceptive for your own comfort, I suspect." "Mrs. Pemberton," Inspector Graves began, his tone suggesting dawning comprehension. "Are you saying—" "I am saying," the housekeeper interrupted, her voice gaining strength, "that I have served in this household for 40 years. 40 years of enduring Edmund Thornfield's casual cruelties, his dismissive remarks, his complete inability to recognize me as anything other than a servant whose sole purpose was to facilitate his comfort. I watched him prey upon vulnerable young people. I watched him humiliate this girl's father out of sheer spite. I watched him manipulate his will as though his money granted him the right to control people's lives and futures." She paused, drawing a breath that seemed to contain the weight of decades of silence. 3 days ago, when he was particularly vile to Eleanor, when I understood what he intended, something broke inside me. I had a small amount of cyanide in my possession. It had been in the gardening shed for years, used to control vermin. I put it in his sherry on the afternoon of his birthday celebration when I was pouring drinks in the study. I did it quickly, while Catherine was, briefly, distracted. I did it because I finally understood that some people do not deserve the luxury of a gradual decline into old age surrounded by family and comfort. The confession hung in the air like a physical manifestation of decades of repressed anguish finally finding voice. Constable Markham moved forward as though to restrain Mrs. Pemberton, but Inspector Graves raised a hand to halt him. The inspector's expression suggested that he understood something that went beyond the simple mechanics of arrest and prosecution. He regarded the housekeeper with a complexity of emotion that spoke to his own understanding of human frailty and the circumstances that could drive even the most ordinary person toward extraordinary violence. "Mrs. Pemberton," the inspector said quietly, "I need you to understand that what you have just confessed to constitutes murder under the law, regardless of your motivations or the justifications you might offer for your actions. You will need to come with me to the station, where you will be formally charged and processed according to legal procedure. Do you understand this?" The housekeeper nodded with a kind of terrible calm, as though a weight she had been carrying for decades had finally been set down. "I understand perfectly," she said. "I am 68 years old, Inspector. I have perhaps 10 or 15 years remaining to me, and I have no illusions about how those years will be spent if I am convicted of murder. But I also understand that I finally did something that mattered, something that was entirely my own choice, made without consideration for consequences or prudence. For the first time in 40 years, I acted according to my own will rather than someone else's. Eleanor had stood and moved toward the housekeeper, grasping her hand. "Mrs. Pemberton, no, you shouldn't have done this for me. I could have." He left. "You could have done nothing," Mrs. Pemberton said gently, squeezing the young woman's fingers. "You were trapped here by family obligation and circumstance just as I was, but unlike me, you still had a future ahead of you. I wanted to ensure that future would not be poisoned, that is the appropriate word, I think, by what Edmund Thornfield would have continued to do to you." Miss Marple had moved toward Mrs. Pemberton, her small frame somehow commanding authority despite her advanced age and physical fragility. "The question that remains," she said to Inspector Graves, "is not whether Mrs. Pemberton administered the poison. She has just confessed to that crime, and her testimony will be supported by physical evidence once you examine the gardening shed and compare the cyanide stored there with the substance that killed Edmund Thornfield. The question that remains is whether she acted alone or whether she had assistance from someone in this household who understood what she was doing and deliberately obscured the evidence afterward." The inspector's attention had immediately sharpened at this suggestion. "You believe someone else was involved in the crime?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that the faint discoloration on the Turkish carpet beneath Edmund's chair, the one you observed but did not fully investigate, was not the result of accident or carelessness. I believe that carpet was deliberately cleaned by someone who understood precisely what had transpired and moved with deliberation to conceal the evidence. And I believe that someone was Dr. Ashford, who placed a protective hand on Eleanor's shoulder when Mrs. Pemberton made her confession, and whose eyes have betrayed a kind of relief rather than shock at the revelation of her guilt." Dr. Ashford did not deny the accusation. Instead, he rose to his feet and faced the inspector with the resignation of someone who had been waiting for this moment since the morning of Edmund's death. "I found the evidence while examining the body," he said quietly. "I noticed the carpet stain, and I understood immediately what it meant. I spent a few moments cleaning it while no one was observing, using the corner of my handkerchief and water from the pitcher on the sideboard. It was a small thing, but it might have been enough to establish reasonable doubt if the investigation had proceeded differently." "You contaminated a crime scene and obstructed justice," Inspector Graves said flatly. "I protected a woman who had endured more suffering than you can possibly imagine," Dr. Ashford replied with equal flatness. "I am aware of the legal consequences of my actions. I am prepared to accept them." Catherine had been watching this exchange with visible shock, as though the revelation that multiple people in the household had been engaged in various forms of deception and complicity had exceeded her capacity for comprehension. "So you were all conspiring against my uncle?" she asked, her voice containing a kind of hollow disbelief. "Mrs. Pemberton, who served him faithfully for 40 years, Dr. Ashford, who was his physician and trusted advisor, even Eleanor, who was his granddaughter. We were not conspiring," Mrs. Pemberton said gently. "I acted alone and in isolation. Dr. Ashford's involvement was opportunistic rather than planned. As for Eleanor, the child did nothing whatsoever. She is as much a victim of Edmund Thornfield as any of us, merely younger, and thus more vulnerable to his predations." Inspector Graves had begun to issue instructions to Constable Markham regarding the formalities of arrest and the necessity of securing the gardening shed for forensic examination. But before the officer could act, Miss Marple raised her hand in a gesture that commanded attention with remarkable effectiveness given the circumstances. "Inspector," she said, "before you proceed with formal charges, there remains one matter that requires clarification. The revised will, which was never properly executed, currently remains missing from Mr. Thornfield's study. I wonder if you have considered who might have possessed sufficient motivation to remove that document." The inspector paused, his expression suggesting that this question had indeed occurred to him but had been temporarily subordinated to the more pressing matter of identifying and apprehending the murderer. "The theft of the will remains a separate crime," he said. "It will be investigated independently once the murder investigation has reached its conclusion. And yet," Miss Marple continued, "I wonder if the two crimes might not be more intimately connected than they initially appear. After all, Eleanor would benefit considerably if the revised will could not be located or authenticated. The old will, which leaves her with a modest £5,000, would become controlling. She would lose the opportunity to inherit substantially more wealth, but she would also lose the condition imposed upon that inheritance, the requirement that she marry with family approval. Given what she has endured from her uncle's attempted predations, one might argue that the loss of wealth would be considerably less burdensome than the continuation of his influence over her marital future." Eleanor's face had gone completely white. I didn't take the will, Miss Marple. I swear it. I believe you," Miss Marple said gently. "But I suspect that someone else took it with your interests in mind. Someone who understood that your inheritance of a vast fortune, contingent upon Edmund Thornfield's approval of your marriage choice, would constitute a form of extended control over your life that prove as damaging as his physical predations." All eyes in the breakfast room turned toward Catherine, who had gone absolutely rigid in her chair. Her hands, which had been resting on the table, had curled into tight fists, and her jaw had begun to work as though she were struggling to contain words that demanded to be spoken. "Catherine," Inspector Graves said, his tone suggesting that he had begun to perceive the shape of the crime's final layer, "did you remove the will from your uncle's study?" Catherine's answer came not in words but in a kind of helpless laugh that contained more despair than humor. She rose from her seat and moved toward the window, her posture suggesting a woman contemplating her own destruction and finding it somehow inevitable rather than surprising. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I took the will. I found it in his study on the afternoon he died, shortly after Mrs. Pemberton had administered the poison. I had gone to retrieve some documents for the household accounts, and I saw the envelope sitting on his desk. I opened it out of curiosity, and when I read the provisions, I understood that Eleanor's life would be condemned to a form of captivity she could never escape. The money would have been a gilded cage, binding her to approval and control even after Edmund's death. So you destroyed the document," Inspector Graves stated. "I burned it," Catherine confirmed. "In the library fireplace, using the flames from the afternoon fire. I watched it disintegrate into ash, and I understood that by doing so, I was committing a crime: theft, destruction of property, obstruction of Edmund's wishes. But I also understood that I was protecting Eleanor from a form of control that would have been far more insidious and far more permanent than anything Edmund could inflict during his lifetime." Miss Marple had moved toward Theron with an expression of profound sadness. "You acted out of love," she said gently, "but love does not render an action legal or wise. You committed a felony to protect someone from consequences that were not in fact hers to bear. Eleanor would have inherited the money, yes, but she would also have been an adult woman, capable of declining the inheritance if she chose, capable of refusing the conditions Edmund attempted to impose upon it." She was 25 years old and terrified. Catherine replied with sudden fierceness. Edmund had been attempting to manipulate and control her since the moment she arrived. Do you truly believe she would have had the strength to refuse an inheritance of that magnitude, regardless of the conditions attached to it? "I would have," Eleanor said quietly from her seat. "If I had known what the will contained, if I had understood the conditions, I would have refused every penny of it. I would rather live in poverty with my own agency intact than accept a fortune that came with strings Edmund Thornfield had attached from beyond the grave." Catherine's expression crumpled, the realization apparently striking her that her protective intervention had been neither wanted nor ultimately necessary. She sank back into her chair with the appearance of a woman who had just comprehended the full extent of her own miscalculation. Inspector Graves had begun to make notes in his book, his expression suggesting that what had begun as a relatively straightforward murder investigation had transformed into something considerably more complex, a layering of crimes and motivations that revealed the Thornfield household as a place where ordinary human decency had been systematically eroded by wealth, power, and the particular species of cruelty that comes from knowing one will face no meaningful consequences for one's actions. So we have established. Head, the inspector said slowly, that Edmund Thornfield was poisoned by Mrs. Pemberton, motivated by decades of accumulated resentment and by Edmund's predatory behavior toward Eleanor. Dr. Ashford became aware of the crime and deliberately obscured evidence while not actively participating in the murder itself. Catherine, upon discovering Edmund's revised will, destroyed the document in an effort to protect Eleanor from what she believed would be an intolerable form of control. And Eleanor, the ostensible beneficiary of all these actions, was herself a victim who neither sought nor desired the protection being extended to her. That would be an accurate summary, Miss Marple said, though I would add one further observation. What we have witnessed in this household is not merely the mechanics of a single murder, but rather the complete breakdown of social responsibility that occurs when one person is permitted to exercise absolute power over others without accountability. Edmund Thornfield created the circumstances of his own death through decades of casual cruelty and systematic predation. Mrs. Pemberton, Dr. Ashford, Catherine, and even Eleanor herself were all responding to conditions that Edmund had deliberately created and maintained. The poisoning was not an aberration, but rather the inevitable consequence of a system that had become morally bankrupt. The inspector regarded Miss Marple with an expression that suggested he understood the force of her observation, while also recognizing that it had no bearing whatsoever on the legal charges that would now proceed against the various parties involved in the crime. "Miss Marple," he said, "your analysis of human nature is considerably more sophisticated than the law's capacity to address it. Mrs. Pemberton will be charged with murder. Dr. Ashford will be charged with obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence. Hence, Catherine will be charged with theft and destruction of property. Eleanor will be released as she has committed no crime. And Edmund Thornfield will be buried with all the ceremony and respect due to a man of his social standing, despite the moral bankruptcy of his character, which is," Miss Marple said softly, "precisely how these matters always conclude." "Justice and law are not synonymous concepts, Inspector. The legal system will proceed along its prescribed pathways, and the village will gradually return to its ordinary rhythms. But the truth, the genuine understanding of what transpired here and why, will remain known only to those of us present in this room." As the morning light continued to strengthen through the breakfast room windows, transforming the November day into something approaching beauty, the various members of the Thornfield household began the slow process of accepting the consequences of their choices. Mrs. Pemberton stood without resistance when Constable Markham approached to take her into custody. Dr. Ashford followed with equal resignation. Catherine sat in silence, contemplating a future that would now be substantially constrained by legal proceedings and social scandal. Only Eleanor seemed somehow lighter, as though the revelation of truth, however devastating, had lifted from her the burden of perpetual uncertainty regarding the people around her and their true nature. Miss Marple observed this transformation with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had witnessed once again the peculiar manner in which truth, however painful, could ultimately prove more merciful than comfortable deception. As she prepared to return to her own cottage later that afternoon, Miss Marple reflected on the essential tragedy of the Thornfield household. Not that Edmund had been poisoned, but that it had taken his death to force his family and associate to finally acknowledge the reality of his character. In the village of St. Mary Mead, as in countless small communities throughout England, the same patterns repeated themselves endlessly, the powerful corrupting those beneath them, the vulnerable enduring in silence, and occasionally, when circumstances aligned precisely, someone finally breaking beneath the accumulated weight of systemic cruelty. The village would recover. It always did. Life would continue its measured progression through seasons and years. But those who had been present at Thornfield Manor would carry forward the memory of these days, a memory that would serve as a kind of permanent testament to the capacity of human beings for both extraordinary compassion and devastating selfishness, often in equal measure.